The morning air was crisp and cold as Rebecca pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders. Living alone on the edge of the wilderness wasn't easy, but she had learned to make do with what nature provided. Her small cabin sat on 20 acres of rugged land in what would later become North Carolina, far from any other settlers. Rebecca had been tracking a wounded deer since dawn. The animal had stumbled into one of her traps during the night, but somehow managed to break free. Now, she followed the blood trail deeper into the forest than she had ever gone before. Winter was coming fast. She couldn't afford to lose what might be her last chance at fresh meat before the snow fell. Most folks in the nearest settlement would have turned back by now. They all whispered stories about the Cherokee people who lived in these mountains. Some called them dangerous. Others said they were mysterious and kept to themselves. Rebecca had heard both sides, but she had never actually met any of them herself. What she did know was that she needed that deer. Her husband had died 2 years ago from fever, leaving her to survive on her own. She had learned to hunt, trap, and live off the land because she had no choice. The deer tracks were fresh, and the blood drops on the fallen leaves told her the animal was badly hurt. It wouldn't make it much farther. The forest grew thicker as she moved deeper into Cherokee territory. Tall oak and pine trees blocked out most of the sunlight, creating shadows that seemed to move with every breeze. Rebecca checked her rifle for the 3rd time, making sure it was loaded and ready. She only had a few shots left, so she would need to make them count. Birds chirped overhead, and squirrels chattered as they gathered nuts for winter. Everything seemed peaceful and normal. That's why the sound hit her like a punch to the stomach. A child was screaming. Rebecca froze in place. Listening carefully, the screams came again, high-pitched and full of terror. But there was something else mixed in with the child's cries. A deep, angry roaring that made her blood run cold. She had heard that sound before, back in Scotland when she was young. Father had told her stories about bears in the highlands, and she had seen one once from a safe distance. But this roar was different, louder, more dangerous. Without thinking, Rebecca ran toward the sound. Her boots crashed through the underbrush as branches grabbed at her coat and scratched her face. The screaming got louder, more desperate. Whatever was happening, she was getting closer. She burst through a wall of thick bushes and stopped short. In front of her was a sight that made her heart race with fear. A massive grizzly bear stood on its back legs, easily 8 feet tall. Its brown fur was matted and dirty, and its claws were longer than her fingers. The bear was swiping at a rocky cliff face. It was trying to reach something above. That something was a young boy. The child couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He clung to a narrow ledge about 10 feet up the cliff, his small hands gripping the rough stone. Blood ran down his leg from deep claw marks, and Rebecca could see that he was getting weaker with each passing second. The boy's dark hair was tied. Back and his clothes were made from animal skins, decorated with colorful beads. Even in her panic, Rebecca realized this was a Cherokee child. One of the people she had been warned to stay away from. But right now, none of that mattered. The boy was going to die if someone didn't help him. The bear noticed her arrival and turned its massive head toward her. Its small black eyes were filled with rage, and saliva dripped from its open mouth, revealing teeth that could crush bone. Rebecca had never seen anything so terrifying in her life. The boy looked down at her too, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He spoke rapidly in a language she didn't understand, but his meaning was clear. He was begging for help. Rebecca's mind raced. The bear was too close to the boy for her to get a clean shot without risking hitting the child. Even if she could kill the bear with one bullet, there was no guarantee it would drop immediately. An injured grizzly could still do tremendous damage before it died. The boy's grip was slipping. His hands were covered in his own blood, making it hard to hold on to the smooth rock. He had maybe a minute before he fell right into the bear's waiting claws. In that moment, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She stepped forward and started yelling at the top of her lungs. "Hey, over here, you big monster! Come and get me!" The bear turned away from the boy and focused all its attention on her. She had succeeded in drawing it away, but now she faced a problem she hadn't fully thought through. You're standing 30 feet away from an enraged grizzly bear with nothing but a single-shot rifle And a hunting knife? The bear dropped to all fours and started moving toward her. Each step shook the ground, and Rebecca could hear its heavy breathing getting closer. She raised her rifle and took careful aim, knowing she would only get one chance. "Stay up there, boy," she shouted to the child, hoping he would understand her tone, even if he didn't know her words. "Don't come down no matter what happens." The bear was 20 feet away now, then 15, then 10. Rebecca pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest like thunder. Birds flew from their perches, and small animals scattered in every direction. The bullet hit the bear in the shoulder, spinning it around and causing it to roar in pain and anger. But it didn't fall. Instead, the wounded bear became even more dangerous. It rose up on its back legs again and charged straight at her. Threw her empty rifle aside and pulled out her hunting knife. The blade was sharp and sturdy, but it looked like a tiny needle compared to the bear's massive claws. She had maybe 3 seconds before the bear reached her. In those seconds, Rebecca thought about her dead husband and the life they had planned together. She thought about the empty cabin waiting for her back home. And she thought about the scared boy on the ledge who reminded her of the children she had always wanted but never had. She wasn't going to let him die, not if she could help it. The bear swung its massive paw at her head. Rebecca ducked and rolled to the side, feeling the wind from the near miss ruffle her hair. She came up behind the bear and stabbed her knife deep into its back leg. The bear spun around faster than she thought possible and caught her across the shoulder with its claws. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. She felt her coat and shirt tear, along with the skin underneath. But she held onto her knife and kept fighting. Above them, Cherokee boy watched in amazement as this strange white woman risked her life to save him. He had been taught to fear and distrust her people, but here was one willing to die for him without even knowing his name. The battle between Rebecca and the bear lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. She managed to wound the animal several more times while it tore at her clothes and skin. Finally, she found an opening and drove her knife deep into the bear's neck. The grizzly let out one final roar and collapsed. Rebecca fell to her knees beside the dead bear, breathing hard and bleeding from multiple wounds. Her shoulder felt like it was on fire, and she could barely lift her right arm, but she was alive. And more importantly, so was the boy. She looked up at the ledge and saw him staring down at her with wonder in his eyes. He said something in Cherokee that sounded like a question. "It's okay," she called up to him, even though she wasn't sure he understood. "You can come down now. The bear is dead." The boy carefully climbed down from the ledge, favoring his injured leg. When he reached the ground, he walked slowly toward Rebecca and the dead bear. Up close, she could see that he was indeed about 12 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and a brave expression despite everything he had been through. A claw. Marks on his leg were deep, but not life-threatening. He knelt beside her and examined her wounds with the careful attention of someone who knew about such things. Then he looked into her eyes and spoke a single word that she somehow understood. "Why?" Rebecca managed a weak smile despite her pain. "Because you're just a kid," she said. "And kids shouldn't have to fight bears all by themselves." The forest fell silent after the bear's final roar. Rebecca sat on the ground, breathing heavily as pain shot through her shoulder with every heartbeat. Blood soaked through her torn coat, and she could feel it running down her arm. The Cherokee boy stood a few feet away, watching her with curious eyes. He limped closer, and Rebecca got her first good look at him. Despite his young age, there was something wise about his face. His leg was still bleeding from the bear's claws, but he seemed more concerned about her injuries than his own. The boy knelt beside her, gently touched her wounded shoulder. She winced at the contact, but his touch was careful and gentle. He examined the deep gashes left by the bear's claws, then looked around the forest as if searching for something. Rebecca tried to stand up, but dizziness washed over her immediately. She had lost more blood than she realized. Her vision blurred, and she had to grab onto a nearby tree to keep from falling over. The boy said something in Cherokee, his voice urgent and worried. Even though she couldn't understand his words, his meaning was clear. He was telling her to stay still and rest. "Okay," Rebecca said, though they both knew it wasn't true. We need to get out of here. Where there's one bear, there might be more. The boy tilted his head, clearly not understanding her English. But he seemed to grasp that she was worried about danger. He pointed deeper into the forest and shook his head, then pointed back toward where Rebecca had come from. Rebecca realized. He was trying to tell her something important about the area. Maybe he knew these woods better than anyone. After all, this was his people's land. She tried to take a step, but her legs felt weak and shaky. The boy quickly moved to her side and offered his shoulder for support. Despite his own injury, he was trying to help her walk. Together, they made their way away from the dead bear. The boy led her to a small clearing surrounded by thick bushes that would hide them from view. A tiny stream ran through the middle, providing fresh water. Rebecca collapsed beside the stream, exhausted from the short walk. Her shoulder throbbed with each pulse of her heart, and she could feel herself getting weaker. The boy knelt beside the water and began washing the blood from his own leg wound. She watched as he carefully cleaned the claw marks. His movements were skilled and practiced, like he had dealt with injuries before. When he finished with his own wound, he moved over to her. The boy pointed to her shoulder and then to the stream. He was asking if he could help clean her wounds too. Rebecca nodded, too tired to be worried about a stranger touching her injuries. He was incredibly gentle as he helped her remove her torn coat and shirt. The cold air hit her wounds and made her shiver, but the boy worked quickly. He cupped water in his hands and carefully washed away the blood and dirt from the bear's claws. While he worked, Rebecca studied his face. He couldn't be more than 12. But he moved with the confidence of someone much older. His hands were steady, and he seemed to know exactly what he was doing. After cleaning her wounds, the boy disappeared into the forest. Rebecca panicked for a moment, thinking he had abandoned her. But he returned quickly, carrying several plants she didn't recognize. He sat beside her and began chewing one of the plants. Rebecca watched in fascination as he created a green paste in his mouth, then carefully applied it to her shoulder wounds. Whatever it was, it immediately began to numb the pain. "How do you know how to do that?" she asked, even though she knew he couldn't understand her. The boy smiled and pointed to himself, then made gestures that seemed to indicate his grandmother or an older woman. He was telling her that someone had taught him these healing skills he worked on her injuries. Rebecca found herself really looking at this child who had risked so much to help her. His clothes were made from soft deer hide, decorated with intricate beadwork and blue and red patterns. A small pouch hung from his belt, probably containing more of the healing plants he had used. Most striking were his eyes. They were dark brown and seemed much older than his years. Rebecca had heard that Cherokee children grew up fast, learning to survive in the wilderness from a young age. This boy was proof of that. When he finished treating her wounds, the boy pulled out a piece of dried meat from his pouch. He broke it in half and offered her the larger piece. Rebecca's stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since dawn. "Thank you," she said, accepting the food gratefully. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing the stream water to wash down the tough meat. Rebecca noticed that the boy kept glancing toward the forest, as if listening for something. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the temperature dropped quickly. Rebecca shivered in her torn shirt, and the boy noticed immediately. He disappeared again and returned with an armful of dry leaves and small branches. Working quickly, he built a small fire pit using stones from the stream. Within minutes, he had a warm fire crackling between them. The heat felt wonderful against Rebecca's cold skin. The boy sat across from her, firelight dancing across his young face. He pointed to himself and said something that sounded like Ayana. Then he pointed to her with a questioning look. Rebecca realized he was telling her his name and asking for hers. "Rebecca," she said, pointing to herself. "Rebecca," he repeated slowly, practicing the unfamiliar sounds. She tried to say his name back, "Anna." He smiled and nodded, pleased that she was making the effort to learn his name. As the night grew darker, Rebecca found herself thinking about how strange the situation was. Just this morning, she had been a lonely widow living on the edge of civilization. Now, she was sharing a campfire with a Cherokee boy whose life she had saved. Her people and his people were supposed to be enemies. She had heard stories of conflicts between settlers and the Cherokee. Some folks said the native people couldn't be trusted. Others claimed they were savage and dangerous. But looking at Ayanna as he carefully tended the fire and checked on her. Bandages. Rebecca couldn't see anything savage or dangerous about him. He was just a brave, Cajun boy who had shown her more kindness than most white folks ever had. The pain in her shoulder was getting worse as the night progressed. Despite the healing plants Ayanna had used, the wounds were deep and serious. She was also running a fever, which made her feel dizzy and confused. Ayanna noticed her distress and moved closer to the fire. Gathering more healing plants from his pouch, he prepared another batch of the green paste and applied it to her wounds. The medicine helped with the pain, but Rebecca could tell she was in serious trouble. She had lost a lot of blood, and without proper medical care, infection could set in. In the wilderness, far from any doctor or town, that could be a death sentence. Ayanna seemed to understand the seriousness of her condition, kept the fire burning bright throughout the night, checking on her every few minutes. When she shivered with fever, he found ways to keep her warm. When she became delirious and talked nonsense, he sat beside her and spoke softly in Cherokee, his voice calm and reassuring as dawn approached. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness. In her fevered dreams, she saw her dead husband's face and heard his voice telling her to hold on. She dreamed of the home she had left behind in Scotland and the new life she had tried to build in America. But mostly, she was aware of the young Cherokee boy who refused to leave her side. Even though helping her could put him in danger with his own people, when she woke up fully, the sun was high in the sky, and Ayanna was cooking something over the fire. Her fever had broken during the night, and while she still felt weak, the worst of the crisis had passed. Ayanna smiled when he saw her sitting up. He offered her a bowl made from a large leaf, filled with a warm broth that tasted like herbs and small pieces of meat. "Thank you," Rebecca said. It meant it more than she had ever meant anything in her life. This boy had saved her life just as surely as she had saved his. The second day in the forest began with the sound of distant drums. Rebecca woke to find Ayanna sitting perfectly still beside their dying fire, his head tilted as he listened to something she couldn't hear. His young face was tight with worry. "What is it?" she whispered, though she already suspected the answer. Ayanna looked at her with troubled eyes and pointed toward the sound. Then he pointed to himself and made a gesture that clearly meant his people were looking for him. The drums were a search signal, and they were getting closer. Rebecca's heart sank. She knew what this meant. When Ayanna's tribe found them together, they would see a white woman with their missing child. They wouldn't stop to ask questions or listen to explanations. They would assume the worst, but Ayanna surprised her. Instead of running toward the drums to signal his location, he quickly began gathering their few belongings. He gestured for Rebecca to stay quiet and follow him deeper into the forest, away from the search party. "You should go to them," Rebecca said, struggling to sit up. "They're your family. They're worried about you." Ayanna shook his head firmly. He knelt beside her and pointed to her bandaged shoulder, then to himself. His meaning was clear. He wasn't leaving her alone when she was still hurt and vulnerable. Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes. This brave boy was willing to stay lost in the wilderness rather than abandon someone who needed help. She had never encountered such loyalty, not even from adults in her own community. They spent the morning moving slowly through the forest, with Ayanna supporting Rebecca when her strength failed. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, leading her to places where they could rest and find water. His knowledge of the land was incredible. During one of their rest stops, Rebecca noticed that Ayanna kept glancing at her with a thoughtful expression. Finally, he sat down facing her and began to speak in Cherokee. His voice was soft and patient, as if he was telling her a story, even though she couldn't understand his words. Rebecca found herself drawn into his tale. He used his hands to gesture, painting pictures in the air, pointed to the sky, then to the earth, then to himself, and to her. Gradually, she began to understand that he was telling her about his people's beliefs. From what she could gather, he was explaining that all living things were connected. The animals, the trees, the water, and even people like her and him, they were all part of the same great circle of life. When someone saved another's life, created a bond that couldn't be broken. Rebecca had never heard anything like this before. In her world, people were divided by the color of their skin, their religion, and where they came from. But Ayanna was describing something completely different, a world where what mattered was how you treated others, not what you looked like. As the day wore on, Rebecca's condition improved slightly, but she was still far from healthy. The wounds on her shoulder were healing thanks to Ayanna's plant medicines, but she remained weak from blood loss. Walking for more than a few minutes at a time left her dizzy and exhausted. Ayanna seemed to understand her limitations perfectly. Found them a sheltered spot near a small waterfall where they could rest safely. The sound of falling water would mask any noise they made. The rocky area around the falls would be difficult for searchers to navigate. While Rebecca rested, Ayanna worked tirelessly to care for her. He gathered fresh healing plants, caught fish from the stream with his bare hands, and even found wild berries that added sweetness to their simple meals. Everything he did showed a maturity far beyond his years. During their second evening together, something changed between them. They had been sitting by their small fire, sharing a meal of roasted fish and berries, when Rebecca began to talk about her life. She didn't know if Ayanna could understand her words, but somehow it felt right to share her story with him. She told him about her husband, James, who had died of fever 2 winters ago. She described how lonely she had been since then, living by herself on the edge of the wilderness. She talked about the dreams she and James had shared of building a farm and raising children together. As she spoke, tears began to flow down her cheeks. She hadn't cried about James in months, but something about Ayanna's patient, understanding presence made her feel safe enough to grieve. Ayanna listened to every word, even though he couldn't understand them. When she began to cry, he moved closer and gently placed his small hand on her arm. His dark eyes were full of compassion, and Rebecca realized that kindness needed no translation. In return, Ayanna began to share his own story. He spoke in Cherokee, but his gestures and expressions helped Rebecca understand parts of what he was saying. He pointed to himself as a small child, then gestured to show people leaving or going away. Rebecca realized he was telling her about the forced removal of his people from their ancestral lands. He showed her how his family had been separated, how they had walked for many days with little food or water. Some of the older people and small children hadn't survived the journey. Ayanna had lost his parents during that terrible time and now lived with his grandparents. Rebecca felt her heart break as she watched. This young boy described such tragedy. She had heard rumors about the Cherokee being forced to leave their homes, but she had never really understood what that meant for families like Ayanna's. That night, as they lay beside their fire under a canopy of stars, Rebecca made a decision. She would learn Ayanna's language, and she would teach him hers. If they were going to survive this ordeal together, they needed to be able to really communicate. She started with simple words, pointing to objects and saying their English names. Water, she said, pointing to the stream. Fire, she said, gesturing to their campfire. A tree, she said, touching the bark of a nearby oak. Ayanna caught on immediately and began teaching her the Cherokee words for the same things. Ama, he said, for water. Atsila for fire. Nvi for tree. They spent hours this way, laughing at each other's pronunciation mistakes and celebrating when they got something right. For the first time since her husband's death, Rebecca felt genuinely happy. On their third morning together, Ayanna woke before dawn and spent time sitting quietly by the stream. Rebecca watched him from their sleeping area, wondering what he was thinking about. When he returned, his expression was different. More serious and determined, he sat beside her and began to speak in a mixture of Cherokee and the few English words he had learned. From what she could understand, he was trying to tell her about his grandfather, who was an important man in their tribe. Ayanna drew pictures in the dirt with a stick, showing her his family tree. He pointed to an older man and repeated a word that sounded like chief or leader. Then he pointed to himself and made gestures that suggested he was important too. Perhaps being trained for leadership, Rebecca began to understand that Ayanna wasn't just any Cherokee boy. He was connected to the tribe's leadership, which meant his disappearance was probably causing great concern among his people. It also meant that when they found him with her, The consequences could be even more serious than she had imagined. But Ayanna had already thought of this. He pulled out a small piece of bark and began scratching symbols on it with his knife. Rebecca watched, fascinated, as he created what looked like a form of writing. When he finished, he showed her the bark and pointed to himself. Then to her, then to the dead bear they had left behind days ago. He was creating a message that would tell his people what had really happened. Rebecca realized that Ayanna was not only brave and kind, but also incredibly smart. He was preparing to protect her when his people finally found them. He was going to make sure they understood that she had saved his life, not harmed him. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they both knew their time together was running out. The drums had been getting closer each day, and sooner or later, the search party would find their trail. But something beautiful had happened during their 3 days together. Two people from different worlds had found common ground in courage, kindness, and mutual respect. They had become true friends, bound together by the experience they had shared. When the searchers finally came, they would find something unprecedented. A Cherokee boy and a white woman who had learned to trust each other completely. Despite everything their peoples had been taught about each other, the morning of the 4th day brought sounds that made both Rebecca and Ayanna freeze in place. Voices carried through the forest, speaking in rapid Cherokee. They were too close to run or hide anymore. Ayanna looked at Rebecca with eyes that seemed far too serious for a 12-year-old boy. He held up the piece of bark where he had scratched his message and pointed toward the approaching voices. Then he did something that surprised her completely. He stood up and placed himself directly between Rebecca and the direction of the voices. His small body was tense, ready to defend her if necessary. This brave child was prepared to stand against his own people, to protect a white woman he had known for only 3 days. "No," Rebecca whispered, struggling to her feet despite the pain in her shoulder. "You don't need to do that, I'll be okay." But Ayanna shook his head firmly. He had made his decision, and nothing would change his mind. The voices grew louder, and soon Rebecca could hear the sound of footsteps crashing through the underbrush. There were several men, and they were moving fast. The search party had finally found their trail. Ayanna cupped his hands around his mouth and called out in Cherokee. His voice rang through the forest, strong and clear. He repeated the call 3 times, then waited. The forest fell silent. Then, from not far away, came an answering call. Rebecca could hear the relief and joy in that voice. Like someone who loved Ayanna had been searching desperately for him. Within minutes, 6 Cherokee warriors emerged from the trees surrounding their small camp. Rebecca had never seen anything like them. They moved through the forest like shadows, appearing almost magically from behind trees and rocks. Each man carried weapons, bows, knives, and war clubs, and their faces were painted with stripes of red and black. The lead warrior was taller than the others, with broad shoulders and graying hair braided with feathers. Taking in the small fire, Rebecca's torn and bloodied clothes, and Ayanna standing protectively in front of her. When this man saw Ayanna, his stern expression cracked. Rebecca could see the love and relief that flooded his face. This had to be Ayanna's father or grandfather, someone who had been terrified of losing him. The warrior spoke Ayanna's name with such emotion that Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes. Then his gaze hardened as he looked at her. She saw his hand move toward his knife. But Ayanna stepped forward quickly, holding up his piece of bark and speaking rapidly in Cherokee. His voice was urgent and pleading. He pointed to Rebecca, then to himself, then gestured wildly as he told his story. The warriors listened intently, but Rebecca could see doubt and suspicion in their faces. One of the younger men said something harsh and took a step toward her, his hand on his weapon. That's when Ayanna did something that shocked everyone. He moved to stand directly in front of Rebecca again and spread his arms wide, protecting her with his own body. Then he spoke one word in English, loud and clear. No. The simple word hung in the air like a challenge. This Cherokee boy was defying his own warriors to protect a white woman. The lead warrior's eyes widened in surprise. Ayanna continued speaking in Cherokee, his young voice filled with passion and conviction. He held up his piece of bark again, pointing to the symbols he had carved. Then he rolled up his pants leg to show the healing claw marks from the bear attack. The warriors crowded around to examine his wounds. Rebecca watched their faces change, as they realized the marks could only have come from a large predator. These were experienced hunters who knew the signs of animal attacks. The lead warrior knelt down to Ayana's level and spoke to him gently. Rebecca could tell he was asking questions about what had happened. Ayana answered each question carefully, pointing to Rebecca and making gestures that told the story of their encounter with the bear. Then Ayana did something that made Rebecca's heart pound, took the warrior's hand and led him toward the place where they had fought the grizzly bear 3 days earlier. The other warriors followed, surrounding Rebecca as they walked. When they reached the spot, everything changed. The massive bear's body still lay where it had fallen. Now partially eaten by scavengers but still impressive in size, the warriors examined the carcass carefully, pointing to the rifle wound in its shoulder and the knife wounds that had killed it. They looked at the rocky ledge where Ayana had been trapped, noting the bloodstains on the stone. They examined the ground where Rebecca had fought the bear, seeing the signs of the desperate battle that had taken place. Most convincing of all, they found Rebecca's empty rifle where she had thrown it during the fight. The lead warrior picked it up and examined it carefully. He could see that it had been fired recently, and the bullet wound in the bear matched the size of her weapon as the evidence mounted. The warrior's expressions began to change. The suspicion and hostility faded, replaced by something Rebecca had never expected to see in Cherokee faces when they looked at her respect. The lead warrior approached Rebecca slowly, his hands empty and non-threatening. When he reached her, he did something that took her breath away, placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly. Then he spoke in careful, broken English. "You, ... save." "Boy," Rebecca nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. The warrior's eyes filled with emotion. He pointed to Ayana and said, "My ... grandson." Rebecca felt her knees go weak. Ayana wasn't just any Cherokee child. He was the grandson of what appeared to be a chief or important leader. And she had saved his life, the old warrior continued, speaking in his limited English, with Ayana translating the words he didn't know. Gradually, Rebecca began to understand that this man was called Chief Adahi, and he was one of the most respected leaders in their community. He explained that Ayana had been out hunting alone, when he should have stayed closer to their settlement. The boy had been trying to prove himself as a man, but had gotten into more trouble than he could handle. "Chief." Adahi looked at Rebecca with tears in his eyes as he spoke about what her actions meant to him and his family. Ayana was not just his grandson. The boy was being trained to be a future leader of their people. His loss would have been devastating to the entire tribe as they prepared to leave the forest. Chief Adahi made a decision that would change everything. He called his warriors together and spoke to them in Cherokee. Rebecca couldn't understand the words, but she could see that he was giving them important instructions. Then he turned to Rebecca and spoke slowly in English. With Ayana helping to translate the more difficult concepts, "You've given us the greatest gift possible," he said. "You risked your life for one of our children without knowing who he was or expecting any reward. This creates a debt that can never be repaid." He paused and looked at each of his warriors, then continued. "In Cherokee law, when someone saves a life, especially the life of a child, they become family, not by blood, but by choice and honor." Rebecca didn't fully understand what he was saying, but she could tell it was something important. Chief Adahi gestured for one of his warriors to help support Rebecca as they walked. Her injuries were still serious, and the long trek back to their settlement would be difficult for her. As they began the journey, Ayana walked beside her, chattering excitedly in a mixture of Cherokee and English. He was clearly proud and happy about something, but Rebecca was too tired and overwhelmed to understand what it was. The other warriors treated her with a respect she had never experienced before. They made sure she had water when she needed it, helped her over difficult terrain, and even shared their food with her during rest stops. But it wasn't until they crested a hill and she saw the Cherokee settlement spread out below them that Rebecca truly understood what was happening. The entire community, men, women, and children, were gathered in the central area. waiting for their return. When the people saw Chief Adahi and the warriors approaching with Ayanna safe and sound, a great cheer went up. But when they noticed Rebecca walking among them, the cheering stopped and curious murmurs rippled through the crowd. Chief Adahi raised his hand for silence, then began to speak in a voice that carried across the entire settlement. Rebecca couldn't understand his words, but she could hear the emotion and importance in his tone as he spoke. She saw the faces in the crowd change from curiosity to amazement to something that looked like awe. By the time he finished speaking, every eye in the settlement was fixed on her with an expression she had never seen before in her life. Ayanna tugged on her sleeve and grinned up at her. "Grandmother wants to see you," he said in his careful English. "She says you are a very special woman." Rebecca was about to find out just how special the Cherokee people considered her to be. The Cherokee settlement was unlike anything Rebecca had ever seen. Dozens of log cabins and traditional houses dotted the landscape, connected by well-worn paths. Gardens full of corn, beans, and squash grew between the homes and children played. In the open spaces, while their mothers worked nearby, as Chief Adahi led Rebecca through the community, people emerged from their homes to stare at the white woman walking among them. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion. But most displayed the same awe she had seen when the chief finished his speech. Ayanna stayed close to her side, translating whispered comments from the crowd. "They are saying you must be very brave," he told her quietly. "Some are calling you bear fighter." Rebecca felt overwhelmed by all the attention. She had never been the center of anything like this before. In her own community, she was just a widow living alone on the edge of nowhere. Here, she seemed to be some kind of hero. Chief Adahi stopped in front of the largest building in the settlement, a circular structure made of logs and stones with smoke rising from a hole in the center of its roof. This was clearly an important place, perhaps where the tribe held their most sacred ceremonies. "Council House," Ayanna explained, seeing her curious expression. "Very important place. Only special meetings happen here." An elderly woman appeared in the doorway of the council house. She was small and bent with age, but her dark eyes were sharp and intelligent. Her gray hair was braided with shells and feathers, and she wore a dress decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. This had to be the grandmother. Ayanna had mentioned someone very important in the tribe's spiritual life. The old woman approached Rebecca, slowly, studying her face with intense concentration. She walked around Rebecca in a complete circle, examining her like she was trying to see into her very soul. Finally, grandmother stopped in front of Rebecca and spoke in Cherokee. Her voice was soft but carried an authority that made everyone around them fall silent. Ayanna translated in a whisper. "Grandmother says your spirit is clean and good. She says the ancestors guided you to save me for a reason." The grandmother reached out and gently touched Rebecca's wounded shoulder. "Ah!" Even through the bandages, Rebecca could feel warmth spreading from the old woman's fingers. It was as if she was checking not just the physical wounds, but healing something deeper. Chief Adahi spoke to his mother in Cherokee, gesturing toward Rebecca and Ayanna. The grandmother listened carefully, then nodded slowly. She said something back that made the chief's eyes widen in surprise. "What did she say?" Rebecca asked Ayanna. The boy looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure how to translate the words. "Says ... you are chosen. The Great Spirit sent you to protect our people's future." Rebecca didn't understand what that meant, but she could see it was significant. People in the growing crowd began to murmur, excitedly among themselves. The grandmother gestured for everyone to enter the council house. Rebecca found herself being led into the circular building, where a fire burned in the center and wooden benches surrounded the walls. The air smelled of cedar smoke and sage. As people filed in, Rebecca realized this wasn't just a casual meeting. The most important members of the tribe were gathering: warriors, elders, mothers with children, and respected leaders. Everyone who had a voice in tribal decisions was here. Chief Adahi helped Rebecca sit on a bench near the fire, with Ayanna beside her to translate. The grandmother took her place across from them, and the chief began to speak. His voice carried throughout the council house as he told the complete story of what had happened in the forest. He described how Rebecca had risked her life to save Ayanna from the grizzly bear, how she had been badly wounded in the fight, and how Ayanna had cared for her during their 3 days together. As he spoke, Rebecca watched the faces around her. She saw mothers clutching their children closer as they imagined the danger Ayanna had faced. She saw warriors nodding with respect as they heard about her courage in fighting the bear. Most importantly, she saw understanding dawn in their eyes as they realized what her actions truly meant. When Chief Adahi finished his account, the grandmother stood and began to speak. Her voice was different from the chief's, softer, but somehow more powerful. Ayanna leaned close to Rebecca's ear to translate. She says that in all the history of our people, no white person has ever risked their life to save a Cherokee child, without expecting payment or reward. She says this proves that good hearts exist in all races of people. The grandmother continued speaking, and Ayanna's translation became more emotional. She says that when someone saves a child's life, they save the future itself. You didn't just save me. You saved all the children I might have someday, and their children too. Rebecca felt tears starting in her eyes, as she had never thought about her actions in such grand terms. She had simply seen a child in danger and done what felt right. The grandmother gestured to Ayanna, who stood and walked to the center of the circle. In a clear, strong voice, he began to tell his own version of the story. Even though Rebecca couldn't understand his words, she could hear the emotion and gratitude in his voice. When Ayanna finished speaking, something extraordinary happened. One by one, people in the council house began to stand. First the warriors, then the elders, then the mothers and children. Soon, everyone in the building was on their feet. All looking at Rebecca with expressions of respect and gratitude. Chief Adahi stood as well, and began to speak in a formal, ceremonial tone. Ayanna's translation came in whispers as the chief made what sounded like an official proclamation. Says that by Cherokee law, you have earned the right to be called family, not just friend, but true family, with all the rights and protections that brings. The chief continued, and Rebecca realized she was witnessing something that had probably never happened before in Cherokee history. He says the entire tribe owes you a debt that can never be repaid. From this day forward, you will be under the protection of our people. Anyone who harms you harms all of us. But the grandmother wasn't finished. She approached Rebecca with a beautiful necklace made of shells, turquoise, and carved bone. As she placed it around Rebecca's neck, she spoke. Words that needed no translation, they were clearly a blessing of some kind. She gives you Cherokee name, Ayanna explained, his young voice filled with awe. Atsila Segu, fire protector. She says, you protect the fire of our people's future. The ceremony continued for another hour, with different tribal members standing to speak about what Rebecca's actions meant to them. Some offered gifts, beautifully woven blankets, carved wooden bowls, and containers of healing medicines. Others simply wanted to touch her hand or speak a word of thanks. But the most moving moment came when a young mother approached with a baby in her arms. Through Ayanna, she explained that this was her first child, born just 2 months ago. She wanted Rebecca to hold the baby and give him a blessing, because she believed the fire protector's touch would keep him safe throughout his life. As Rebecca held the tiny infant, feeling his warm weight in her arms, she finally understood what had really happened. She hadn't just saved one boy's life. She had become a symbol of hope and protection for an entire community. When the formal ceremony ended, Chief Adahi made one final announcement that would change Rebecca's life forever. You are welcome to stay with us for as long as you wish, he said through Ayanna's translation. Your cabin in the forest will be protected by our warriors. Your land will be safe from anyone who might try to take it. And if you ever need help, you need only ask. But then he added something that surprised everyone, including his own people. And if our enemies come for us, we will fight for you just as fiercely as you fought for our child. This is our sacred promise. Rebecca realized that this oath worked both ways. The Cherokee weren't just offering her their protection, they were pledging to defend her as one of their own, even against other white settlers if necessary. As the sun set over the Cherokee settlement that evening, Rebecca sat outside Chief Adahi's house, with Ayanna beside her. She wore her new Cherokee necklace and a beautiful deerskin dress the women had given her to replace her torn clothes. Are you happy? Ayanna asked in his careful English. Rebecca looked around at the peaceful settlement, at the families gathered around their evening fires, at the children playing in the fading light. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. "Yes," she said softly, "I think I am." She had come into the forest as a lonely widow tracking a wounded deer. She was leaving as fire protector of the Cherokee people, with a family that stretched across an entire tribe and a young boy who would always think of her as the woman who saved his life. The oath of loyalty sworn that day would last for generations, creating a bond between peoples that would endure long after Rebecca and Ayanna were just memories shared around evening fires.